remember the last time that you broke through the thin ice that you're skating on all the time. You know, everybody knows what that means, right? Is that you're cruising along in your life perfectly content, or at least reasonably content, and then something strikes you out of the blue. Maybe it's the death of someone that you love, or it's the breakup of a relationship, or something that you failed dismally at, or some manner in which you betrayed a friend or they betrayed you, and all of a sudden everything that you stand on disappears and you get swallowed up. Now, it turns out that the motif of being swallowed by something that lurks underneath, like the shark in Jaws, that's a very, very old story. In fact, it's the oldest story that human beings tell. It's the same story, for example, that you see if you watch The Hobbit. Guys, how many of you have seen The Hobbit recently? Or The Lord of the Rings? Yeah, well, you know, in The Hobbit, the little hobbit encounters a dragon, right? And everyone seems to understand what that means, even though it's a completely absurd proposition. And that's allied with this sort of pattern of story. And the idea is something like this, is that your current pattern of being is fragile. And the reason for that is that there's not very much of you and there's an awful lot of the world. And what that means is that at any moment, some element of the world that you have not mastered and do not understand can emerge and destroy you, potentially, your psychological health, your physical health, and your dreams. And that puts you somewhere. And the ancients believed that that put you somewhere that was akin to being devoured by a great beast. And if you're lucky, then, you know, it spits you up later. If you're unlucky, then you stay inside it. And, you know, those are the sorts of people that you see in mental hospitals, or wandering around on the streets, you know, hearing voices and talking to themselves. They never get out. And the standard transformative narrative is descent and ascent. You learn something by deteriorating first and then by reascending as you incorporate it. And I love the story because, well, first of all, to know that story, which is the fundamental story of mankind, to know that story means, first of all, that you understand that there's no learning without pain. And the pain is a necessary prerequisite to transformation. Now, the pain doesn't necessarily have to be of the sort that completely destroys you, but generally, a valuable lesson is one that's difficult to learn. But that also means something very interesting about the human psyche, because, and this is something to really think about too, you know, because you might say, are you who you are? Or are you who you could be? Or are you the thing that changes from who you are to what you could be? And which of those things you identify with makes a huge difference to your life. So, for example, if you are who you are, then you can't talk to someone who doesn't agree with you. You can't listen to them, because they may tell you something that you don't already know, and that'll change you. And if you are who you are, and that's the right way to be, then you don't want to be changed. And if you are who you're going to be in the future, then if any circumstance comes along to destabilize the environment so that that future becomes unlikely, then you're in the same boat. Things are going to fall apart around you. But if you're the thing that can change when change is necessary, well, then you don't have to be who you are or who you could be. You can be the thing that changes, and then when new things come along, regardless of how they're presented to you, well, then you can welcome them, even though they're going to destabilize you, in the hope that what comes out the other side will be an improved version of you. One of the things that I'll talk to you about, especially in the first couple of lectures, is the notion that the idea that you should identify with the part of your psyche that can transform is actually one of the world's most fundamental religious ideas. And the reason I'm discussing religious ideas with you in part is, well, it's partly because when we deal with some of the more profound thinkers in the early part of the course, in the part that deals with psychoanalysis, like Jung, for example, I mean, Jung's depth psychology goes down deep enough into the psyche so that the appropriate language to describe the phenomena that he is dealing with is always religious language. So Jung sort of conceptualized religious language, religious symbols, as part of the grammatical structure of the psyche. So That's an archetype, by the way. That's what an archetype is. An archetype is part of the structure of the psyche. It's something you can't escape from. So I'll give you a quick example of that. So men are much more visually oriented towards sexual stimuli than women. It appears that way. Women seem to be more oriented towards auditory sexual stimuli. So for example, there was a book published a little while ago called Dataclysm. It's the first third of it's quite interesting. It's written by one of the Google Analytics guys, and it's called, I'm wrong. It's called A Billion Wicked Thoughts. I read two that were dealing with internet phenomena. It's called A Billion Wicked Thoughts. And the authors were analyzing pornography usage on the web. And of course, for the longest time, about 35% of web traffic was pornography. And it actually really got the web going, weirdly enough. Men, yeah, it's strange, so that sexual motivation was what drove technological innovation. It's interesting, even now, one of the things that's driving computer chip technology is the necessity for making more and more accurate CGI movies. So it's very strange things often that motivate human progress, right? On the one hand, it's the desire for entertainment, more and more realistic artificial entertainment. On the other hand, it's sex, which is exactly what Freud would presume. Anyways, men look at visual stimuli and women read pornography. So, now, with regards to men, there are some things you can say about what men find attractive sexually if they're heterosexual. So for example, they prefer a waist to hip ratio of about 0.68, and that's standard across body types. So a thin woman who has a waist to hip ratio of 0.68 is attractive, and a mesomorphic woman, a woman of medium build with a waist to hip ratio of 0.68 is also attractive. And that's, in some sense, that's the function of an archetype, and that archetype would be the archetype of Eros or Venus or beauty. And if the problem with those archetypes, in some sense, and this is what makes them archetypal, is you can't argue yourself out of them. They're inbuilt. They're part of your operating system, to use a terrible analogy. So, anyways, Jung's claim was that the archetypal images are religious, fundamentally. That they hit you with the force of religious, what's the word? Revelation. So that's all in that picture.